By the early 1950s, Mac Connor was really among the top tier of illustrators in New York City. That's where the advertising art industry was based, and also a publication center for a lot of the general interest and women's magazines at the time. And by looking at this illustration for one of those stories of romance in a magazine, we can really see a lot of the elements of his best work and pick out things that you could look for as you walk around the gallery and look at each individual work of art. It's clear that this is a romantic story, man and a woman in such an embrace that's obvious. We can tell he's an older man, very handsome, but Mac Connor gives him just a little bit of gray hair to tell us that. The woman with him is clearly a lot younger, and that age difference functions in the plot of the story. Mac Connor always said that for color, he favored very dark or very light colors, not too much in the middle range, and that makes for a very dramatic picture. And we can see that here in her very dark green skirt and a much lighter blouse. Same with the pillows, a dark green one and then a lighter blue one. You'll also notice in the pillows and in the background and the furniture here with the trellises and the ironwork, a lot of patterns. And this is characteristic of his work too. Main thing I think to notice is how he doesn't feel bound to using totally illusionistic space, although in the end we read his work as perfectly three-dimensional. Here's an example. When we look at the whole work of art, we see this as a tabletop with a plant and decoration on the elements that are holding it up. But if you isolate that part of the picture, you can also read that as a as a two-dimensional design, really as a design element. Connor often said he considered himself more a designer almost really than an illustrator or an artist. Same thing is true with the background. Clearly that's a rag rug. We read it that they're lying on the rug, which is receding into the background. But actually it's more like a pattern, repeated elements of a pattern painted as the background. So that type of spatial creativity, which is really characteristic of modernism, but time of the early 1950s, is very characteristic of Mac Connor's work. When Mac Connor was here for the exhibition opening, which we were all felt extremely pleased and privileged that he came to the opening because he's 103 years old, and he was a great participant in the festivities, and he was able to tell me a number of things about his work, including that this was one of his favorites. And this is really a humorous story, but tells us a lot about not just how Connor worked, but about the culture of the country at the time. It's a story about a young man who's trying to attract a young woman's attention, and to do that he buys a television. Now, televisions were extremely novel at the time, this is the early 50s, and also quite expensive. So, as another sign of the times, he brings this television into his house, but he doesn't lock his door, and he tells a lot of neighbors that he has the television. And as a result, all the neighbors feel free to come in and watch the television, even in his absence, while he's busily still trying to attract the young woman's attention. And we can see this sort of panoply of characters, and Connor gives each one an individual stance and gesture and identity that we can read, even though we're not looking at their faces for the most part. We can see these ones in the front are leaning over a little bit into the television, as is the dog is paying close attention. And then there's a man here who hasn't even bothered to take off his hat and see what's going on. A man who's brought in his magazine, sits down to see for a while. It's Collier's magazine. You can see that if you look closely. Here is an older lady, very dignified with her hat, who's sitting ramrod straight, causing this man behind her in a suit to look around her. And it's a composition where you feel, he wants you to feel, as if you're looking down. So we have this sort of odd and exaggerated angle, and that goes to the story, because when we see this scene, the young man and the woman who has finally now paid attention to him are looking down from a higher up window onto the scene. Mac remembered this one well also, and we chose this really as the signature image for the exhibition because, again, it contains so many components that really make his work stand out and be recognizable among other artists. A very, very much of a close-up of a woman's head. This is a motif that he uses often in his work, and it's meant to allow the viewer really to encounter the thinking process, the emotional feelings of the person who's represented. And of course, we don't know, looking at it offhand, what's happening here. We just know that this woman clearly thinking carefully. This man is looking rather unhappy, he's walking away. And this is part of what illustration has to do. Of course, the illustrator's goal is to not tell the whole story, because that would defeat the purpose, but to give you enough of a hint that you're motivated to read the story, read the article, whatever it may be. So this is a story about this woman who's a fashion designer. Many of the stories revolve around people who are advertising executives or fashion designers, fashion models, because that was a level of society that people understood to be the elite, sophisticated, urban people. This is clearly in a city. She is distressed because she has just broken up with this man in an unhappy scene. She's not really sure she's made the right decision. That's why she's got her sort of a puzzled hand to her face. She's thinking things over, wondering if she's taking the right course. Here again, we can see how he handles space. This reads perfectly well as a sidewalk receding into space, but it also reads really as a sort of checkerboard pattern if we look at it in isolation. Here is a secondary character, but perfectly beautifully rendered with all detail, stiletto heels, which became popular in the 50s, and a wonderful hat with a curlicue feather on the top, long sort of columnar brown, and then broken up with the black and gold and white of the rest of her costume. Matt Connor's work is sometimes compared to Alfred Hitchcock's movies, with certain leitmotifs appear and reappear. And this is one. We see these people in the background. This is clearly a very emotional scene. They are the passersby, the bystanders, who are very unemotional. They know nothing about what's happening. And that is characteristic of some of Hitchcock's movies. Remember, sometimes Hitchcock placed himself in such a crowd of disinterested people while there was some drama going on in the foreground. Just going back for a minute to that Hitchcock theme, here is clearly a dramatic scene post-murder. This man is obviously dead with the blood coming out of his forehead. This is a woman who has just discovered him and some secondary characters in the background. This intense sort of thrusting into the viewer's space is something that has been compared to Hitchcock's use of that type of trend in movies like Vertigo and North by Northwest. And in fact, I understand that the creators of the television show Mad Men, of course allied to Matt Connor, his profession at the time as an art director in an ad agency, the creator of that exhibition actually looked at those movies by Hitchcock when he was devising the sequence, opening sequence and graphics for that exhibition. When we look at this again in more detail, we can see something else that we see in Matt Connor frequently, and that is a repeated pattern, very closely repeated forms going back into space, again to create that distance between us and what's happening in the scene, but in this case, sort of dramatically counteracted by the projection of, in this case, the body into space. Also, he was probably told before creating this that there was a limited budget, as there always was, for magazine illustration, and he was probably told to restrict his palette to just a few colors. And he does that masterfully here with the brown and orange-red, which is billowing out from this woman, and we see the clouds. He indicates the clouds' movement by these very brief sort of feathery lines at the edge. This was probably reserved for text. And the stripes, orange-red stripes of this character, and then just a little tiny bit of red here, which indicates the carpet, which really, that's something that for an artist can make all the difference, really brings us into the three-dimensional space. Again, we see it repeated here with the belt of this man's robe. And she, of course, has this very exaggerated and really quite theatrical motion to indicate the horror that she's seeing in this painting. We don't have to worry at all to determine what's happened. We know that there's been a terrible event and everybody is reacting to it. This illustration was done for a story in the Saturday Evening Post, which was called The Hitchhiker. Today it would probably be called The Carjacker. Because this is what has happened. This is a young woman who's recently widowed and lives in New England and is driving across the country with her 4-month-old baby. And somewhere in the middle of the country, she stops to render aid or to speak with someone briefly. It turns out he's an escaped convict, and he immediately points his gun right at her infant son and makes it known that he's going to, that she is going to do whatever he tells her to do. So in the end, she's clever enough to alert another driver, and the police come. In other words, the story has a happy ending, even though this is a startling and scary beginning of it. This shows, among other things, in this illustration, what Connor could do with the human face. And he started his artistic practices as a youth when he was a young boy in New Jersey, where his father owned a general store. Mac liked to draw. He was good at it. And even before he had any formal artistic training, he remembers that he was always drawing, and he was always drawing people. He didn't draw landscapes or imaginary scenes or anything like that. He drew people. And so this has really been a driving force in his artistic method from the very beginning, because undoubtedly it came naturally to him as a young artist, and sort of almost like a young psychologist as he looked at people's faces. You can see this here, this absolute, startled and amazed and frightened woman at this very scary event. The background always remains important, even if the emotion in the foreground is what drives the impact of the illustration. There's always something in the background that adds a degree of realism. It's sort of like those passers-by that we saw in the other one. Here it's a train, and it reinforces the idea that the world at large is not paying attention. That in a way, we are almost privileged to see this amazing event that's scary or beneficent or whatever it is, along with the artist and the author of the story.